don't want to have to wait. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. RSVPers. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. We're going to start in a moment. Can you hear me? All right. It's so lovely to hear the chatter coming in from the panels, but we are going... Thank you. Thank you. It is lovely to hear the chatter as you are innovated from your papers and your panels, but I'm now really excited to welcome the keynote speakers. Thank you so much for being here. I guess I'm audible because you're all hearing me now. Good, excellent. It's my enormous pleasure to welcome the RSVP 2026 Wolff Lecturer. I'm Alison Chapman, and it's my privilege to be the Vice President of RSVP. I'm also Professor of English at the University of Victoria in Canada. RSVP's annual Wolff Lecture is named in honor of the late Michael Wolff, the founding president of RSVP, and of course a periodical studies luminary. This year's Wolff's lecturer is Katherine Bode, Professor of Literary and Textual Studies at Australian National University. Her work lies in the intersection between digital humanities and book history, specializing in particular in Australian newspapers and the transnational circulation of fiction. Across her scholarship, she asks bold and provocative questions that challenge our models of literary history and our evidence for what we think we know. One of her most innovative approaches, for me in any case, is to incorporate her own data curation, which is usually seen as a kind of pre-critical move, into her research as a critical object of inquiry. Her two major monographs, Reading by Numbers, Recalibrating the Literary Field from 2012, and A World of Fiction, Digital Collections and the Future of Literary History from 2018, rocked the field of digital and literary studies. Together, they offer exciting arguments and methodologies, opening up different futures for scholarship, especially in the new terrain it maps out for the relationship between large-scale data analysis and close textual interpretation. So if you don't already know Kath's work, be prepared for your world to be rocked as well. Dr. Bode's talk today is entitled Moving Types, Irishness, Migration, and Machine Learning in Digital Periodical Studies.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind invitation. I'm going to be blushing the entire paper. And thank you to the organising committee for inviting me to speak, and to you all for coming along today. So in Australia, we start papers by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work. And I'm going to do that today. It's the Turrbal and Jagera people, who are the traditional custodians of the land Meanjin around Brisbane. And you'll understand a bit later in the paper, when I get to one of the two stories, I'm going to talk about why I have kept that custom up even overseas. Okay, so I'm going to start today by going to Michael Wolff, since it's his name on the lecture and given his formative influence on the field. We can and should remember Wolff for his arguments, but we miss an essential dimension of his career and influence if we treat them as abstract. So Wolff understood that to study the Victorian periodical in its material specificity, we need to build the conditions for studying it. So this society, this conference, its journal, the Wellesley Index, which Laurel Brake was talking about at the panel I went to yesterday, was it only? It's been such a huge conference already. That infrastructure is inseparable from the case Wolff made for the periodical as the distinctive form of Victorian writing. So Wolff's career in this respect generalises to Victorian periodical studies as a whole, as it tends to foreground something that a lot of other fields either leave implicit or overlook entirely, and that's the fact that our objects and infrastructures of inquiry are entangled. And that's the inheritance I want to reflect on today, and I want to project it forward into new material conditions. So what are those new conditions? Here's one of them. Oh no, now I've gone way too far. Here we are. Okay, so this slide is for all the jet-lagged people in the audience who are, my people coming from Australia. It's the whole argument. So if you can, the rest is illustration. So I hope it's going to be interesting illustration. We'll have some bibliography, digital collections, an Irish novel, a bit of Australia, but it's illustration, right? So, but if you pay attention for 2 minutes now, hopefully you'll have enough of the thread of what I'm going to say that you can drift off, as we do, and still haul yourself back in. Okay, so what are those new material conditions? Is this the shift from print or analogue to digital? No. So digital technologies have wrought important changes in Victorian periodical studies, as they have on most, if not all, humanities fields, via digitisation and digital databases. But digital periodical studies, though transformative in important ways, also reiterated dimensions of print-based and bibliographical reasoning that sustained established structures and systems for interpretation. So that's my overarching argument, really. You didn't even need 2 minutes, but still keep paying attention. That the material changes we're undergoing at the moment and that I'm going to talk about are in important ways more profound and more impactful than anything that's hitherto been associated with the digital humanities. They're changing our objects and infrastructures with new operations and logics. So is this the shift from dumb to intelligent technologies in the sense of entities that cogitate or have consciousness or whatever? Again, no. So such debates I leave for those who want to have them, if they want to. As far as humanities methods go, the term artificial intelligence, I think, at best gets in the way of recognising and addressing the shift I actually want to discuss. And that shift is from deterministic to probabilistic textual practices and systems. So to get us on the same page, I'm going to give you a definition and then an illustration and then a qualification. Then the concentration time will be finished. Okay. So machine learning is the term I used in the title of the paper to invoke this shift. I don't love the term. It carries much of the same cognitivist baggage I just talked about, but it's a name for the mechanism. And that's the move from computational systems that followed step-by-step instructions that we wrote for them to those that are built and run on algorithms, responding probabilistically to what get called patterns in data, which that phrase is also a problem, but that's another soapbox that I won't get onto today. We can talk about it in questions if you like. So second, the illustration. The most common way people are encountering what I'm going to be calling probabilistic language modelling, and you can see why I didn't put it in the title, is with these chatbot interfaces for commercial LLMs like ChatGPT and Claude. So they're part of the material change I'm talking about, but they are only part of what is a broader array of technologies and systems. So this paper's second part will concentrate on a very early, very simple one of them, which is word embedding. And finally, the qualification. So this shift from deterministic to probabilistic textual practices is not absolute. Probabilistic effects have always been part of periodical studies, from the errata of textual transmission to the operations of readerships and the vagaries of archival survival. The role of chance in what we study is very familiar. But key technologies of the digital turn also operated probabilistically. So OCR, I was just having a conversation about it, is the most obvious example. But these long-standing and recent probabilistic operations were embedded in bibliographical infrastructures, most notably libraries, that managed their probabilistic effects. What's new is that these operations, textual, social, historical, technological, as probabilistic operations, are becoming part of the same soup, if you'll allow the metaphor, for what's sometimes called training data, that is fed into mathematically probabilistic systems. So those systems are remaking our objects and our infrastructure, not just in Victorian periodical studies, but not just in the humanities, but across diverse sectors of society. And we're all struggling to understand what they mean. And that struggle is not definable, much less digestible in a single meal. So fields and disciplines are one of the organisations we have for breaking down big things into digestible parts. So that's why I'm asking this question for my presentation. What do these material conditions, these changes, mean for our objects and infrastructures of inquiry and interpretation in Victorian periodical studies? Okay. So I'll do this in two parts. I'll split them fairly evenly in terms of the amount of time I talk about them, but they're fairly disparate in terms of the amount of time they've occupied me. So the first one would be more than a decade, and the second one is just a couple of years. So the first part is the world we've been working in for the past couple of decades, the digital turn, and how it's changed so much, but it's drew on and it's carried forward the bibliographical and other print-based arrangements in ways that enabled interpretive practices to continue, not unchanged, but with significant continuities. My focus will be on the entanglement of my research practices with Trove and the National Library of Australia. And the second part considers these new probabilistic conditions. As I said, it's too big to take on all at once, and I'm not giving you an agenda, I'm not offering solutions. All I have is a toy, a small experiment. So it's run on a simple model over material I know very well, as a way of getting a handle on something too big to hold all at once. So that's what happens when these bibliographically oriented textual objects and infrastructures of inquiry meet probabilistic textual systems. Okay, in both sections I'll be working with the To Be Continued database, which I'll call TBC. And that's a bibliographical and full-text database of fiction in digitised historical Australian newspapers that I've been working on building and investigating since 2013. So these publications include novels, novellas and short stories from around the world. So there's nationalities, of over 20 nationalities represented, but the majority is British, American or Australian. You can see from these numbers that they're across almost 1,500 newspapers, some 50,000 fiction publications now, by some 7,000 known authors. There's a lot of anonymous fiction in there. And it's about 2.5 billion tokens of text in the language of the second part of our paper. So before I go any further, here we're back to the slide that I showed you first. None of what I say is a solo effort. TBC and the work on Irishness I'll discuss are all collaborative. So when I say I'm talking about ongoing work with groups of wonderful people and conversations, even as I'm talking about interventions that I'm specifically making. Okay, so to part one. The existence of TBC depends entirely on Trove. And that's the National Library of Australia's digitisation and aggregation platform, specifically its extensive collection of digitised historical newspapers, which I think is still the largest open access collection in the world. In the first part, I'll discuss the creation of TBC via what I call a paratextual method, and how it relies on bibliographical affordances, including as they are embodied in the Trove database. Along the way, I'll discuss some mistakes that I made due to insufficient attention to the entanglement of my objects and infrastructures. So, winding back to the start of the creation of TBC, the question was how to find fiction. And I knew that I wasn't going to be searching for the titles and authors individually. First, that would take too long, and second, I'd only find the ones that I expected to be there. It also would have been at odds with the large-scale anonymous and pseudonymous publication of these stories, as well as changes in titles that occurred as they circulated. So my original idea of how to find this fiction was not a good one. The name of the project, TBC, To Be Continued, is a fossilised artefact of the original method I proposed in 2012 when I wrote the first grant to begin the work. And this was that I was going to find the fiction by searching for the phrase "to be continued" because it appeared at the end of serialised instalments. And luckily, I mean, this is a sort of the history of my career. My assessors didn't realise what a bad idea it was, so they gave me the money, and that gave me the time, and most importantly, the opportunity to hire bibliographer Carol Hetherington, who I've been working with for so long, to actually work out how it would be better to find this fiction. So why wouldn't this have worked? Well, first, "to be continued" are very common words. They appear in lots of contexts, so they would have thrown up heaps of irrelevant results. And second, where they appear together, they're at the end, and Trove's search algorithm privileges words that appear in the title. So the method I ended up using took advantage of that affordance of print and the newspaper page. So what you can see here is on the left a 19th century newspaper page. Like their contemporary counterparts overseeing websites today, these 19th century newspaper editors wanted their readers to be able to land on a page and immediately differentiate the news reporting from the sport, the 19th century newspapers, as we can see here, the advertising from the fiction. And just for context, due to the enormous size of the Australian colonies and the sparsity of the population, there were very few book publishers or literary journals, but there were lots and lots of newspapers. So newspapers is really where the vast majority of reading, including of fiction, took place. Okay, so consistent paratextual technology was and is a technology that enables readers to quickly search pages and find content. And the paratextual method leverages this affordance by searching for fiction in Trove using words that commonly appear in the paratext. And these include some of those I've got here: serial, novelist, tales and sketches. But the most successful paratextual term, and the one responsible for pretty much 95% of the 50,000 publications in TBC, is chapter. Yeah, so it appears routinely at the start of the fictional instalments. So this approach harnessed the affordance of paratextual technology for human searching and reading for digital discovery. So at the same time, the method worked because it took advantage of digital affordances of the mass digitised newspaper collection that work in alignment with the bibliographical structures. So they include page segmentation, as illustrated here. So unlike many mass digitised newspaper projects, Trove segments the page into articles rather than just giving you the full page of text. As part of page segmentation, Trove manually demarcates the title and corrects manually the first 5 lines of text. So these two affordances work in conjunction with the search algorithm that I mentioned earlier to ensure that OCR had minimal effect on the searches for chapter, and that they were returned to the top of the search results. So it's not a perfect process. It threw up irrelevant results, Masonic chapters, church chapters, and this is something I've been dying to ask this audience. So did your newspapers also have this? In the Australian 19th century newspapers, there was this especially macabre genre called a chapter of accidents, in which The newspapers would report on gruesome ways that people hurt themselves or were killed. So there were lots of chapters of accidents in here. But the vast majority of the results were fiction, and trigger warning for anyone doing manual data entry. Yeah. So another thing that made this project possible was Trove's application programming interface. So they made it open and available. This is a software that allows computer systems to talk to each other so you can grab large amounts of structured data. So this Excel spreadsheet is an example of the type of data that the API brought out. It actually goes along for a lot longer, but I wanted to make it so it was at least a little bit legible. The square shows one of the main things we had to do in the manual process, which is to stitch together the different installments into serialized publications. So they could have hundreds of different installments. But even here, bibliographical structures helped enormously, as we could use the newspaper mastheads, the dates and page numbers, even the order of digitization retained in the article ID for supporting this process. So zooming out for a second, just last year, the National Library of Australia closed its API. And it had to do that because it was being repeatedly attacked by commercial bots wanting to scrape all of its materials. And it has a lot of sensitive cultural materials, including in First Nations culture, and it just has closed it down. So this is the start of those material effects. So I considered going through some findings, and the first version of the paper, I don't know if you all write these long ones, and then you're like, oh, cut. So the first one told you a little bit about how these bibliographical structures helped me to come up with some arguments, but I figured I've written a book on the topic, time is short, so instead I'm going to finish this first section by doing two things. So I'm going to reflect on an intervention that was part of this book that I would do differently today. And I'm going to introduce two stories discoverable by using TBC as bibliographical research infrastructure. So in TBC, the organising entity is the witness, not the work. Some works are published many times in the database, and many of the book's findings were specifically based on that affordance of Trove that it enabled as a means of exploring reprinting and syndication, for instance. This organisation contrasts with that of major bibliographical databases like EBO and ECHO, which broadly follow the edition of one. So recording a single witness for a work, regardless of how many editions exist or existed. So I've included the title of an article of mine from 2017 on this slide because it went into the book as a chapter. While I still think it makes some good points, I didn't recognise this entanglement of objects and infrastructures that I'm speaking about today. So in this article, I criticised literary scholars like Franco Moretti quite unequivocally for presenting literary works as single points in time and space. And I wasn't cognizant in that respect of the extent to which they were making their arguments in accordance with the infrastructural conditions of the databases they were drawing on, as I was with TBC. So to put it differently, it would have been much harder for me to analyse literary works as works rather than witnesses. But both Moretti and I treated our arguments as born of our own scholarly excellence, as we all do. Well, in this room we don't, but a lot of scholars do. Rather than this more complex entanglement of objects and infrastructures of inquiry. Moreover, while we made different arguments with different databases, we were both working within the guardrails of the bibliographical and other print-based organisations of textuality sustained by digital libraries, including by their mass digitised collections. So let's turn now to two stories that I'll introduce as bibliographical objects before taking them up again as experimental objects in the next part of the paper. Sorry, phone is asking for my code. So these stories are also where I'll finally make good on the promise in the title to talk about Irishness and migration, in case you were sort of starting to get a bit itchy about that. I'll tell you exactly how I came to these objects because the material conditions matter for my argument, including as a suggestion of how the two parts of the paper, though held apart structurally, actually work together. So for reasons that will soon become clear, I was interested in Irishness and Chineseness, and I went to the TBC database with keyword searching, and it took me to these stories. You can see why from the titles, I hope. Given a couple of weeks, I could work with these stories in a way that buried the keyword search. So beneath a seamless historical and material argument. I'm not going to do that here, but I will pull out some of the threads that I might use for such an argument. Pseudonymity, genre, the movement of people and texts, and maybe you'll find yourself building an argument that could stitch them together. And if so, that could be a little mini experiment, because that reflex to connect bibliographical objects in bibliographical terms is the training our field gives us. It's wonderful training, and it's that entanglement of objects and infrastructures working in real time. So the first was new to me, though I'm aware that in this room, in this city, I'm probably one of the few people it was new to. So having picked it because it had Irish in the title, I discovered it was the first novel of the Anglo-Irish authors Edith Somerville and Violet Martin, writing as Somerville and Ross. They're best known for The Real Charlotte, which one of the sources I read told me was the most important Irish novel of the 19th century. So I don't know if they're mad, but... So in my reading, I also learnt that An Irish Cousin has quite a complex publishing history, including a second edition reissued with attempts to suppress the first. So this instalment of chapters 1 and 2, published in the Brisbane Daily Mail in 1903, appeared in the same year as the reissued second edition. So I think it must be an Antipodean expression of that publication event. So to this migration of a revised Anglo-American novel to Australia, we can add the plot's migration story. Protagonist Theo, raised in North America, is called home to a rural Irish ancestral estate, to an island she's never been to, where she uncovers a family secret and a local murder. Yeah, it's a Gothic story. So the second story's Irishness is authorial. So the Chinaman number 26 ran under the pseudonym Old Chum in the Brisbane Courier in 1876. So Old Chum was one of the two pseudonyms used by Irish-Australian journalist Joseph Michael Ford, who was born in Dublin in 1840. And he emigrated to Australia as a teenager and began writing for newspapers in 1888, doing so until his death in 1929. So on movement and migration, in this story, a Dublin-born Australian journalist narrates as settler observer, describing the Chinese in Queensland as racialised newcomers. So number 26 implies 25 precursors, and this instalment actually ends by promising a concluding chapter on the work of the Chinese, the work that the Chinese of Australia might be obliged to undertake in future, but it didn't happen. There was nothing that I could find in this newspaper, but in the weekly companion to this newspaper, number 27 was run as the Pioneer under a broader Old Colonials heading. So it was a series of vignettes. So as bibliographical objects, these two stories are indicative of familiar material conditions in this field: pseudonymity, textual revision and reprinting, weird, uncertain publishing histories. But they're not representative, whatever that would mean in this context, of Irishness in Australian literary history or whatever. What happens when we throw these two objects into the soup of training data for probabilistic language modelling? Okay, so we're turning now to part 2 of the paper, where we're going to take a little taste with our toy. So the experiment uses word embedding to investigate both Irishness and probabilistic language modelling. So I'll start with what a word embedding is, using the image that is often, not this particular image, but the type of image, a 2D picture of a 3D space that's often used to describe these type of things. So word embeddings, like all probabilistic language modelling, run on the distributional hypothesis, the idea that words with similar meanings occur in similar contexts. So Firth put it in the 1950s. You should know a word by the company it keeps. So he was a linguist. So programming, windows, and tools, they can all mean different things in company other than software. A word embedding turns that co-occurrence into positions, each word placed by the company it keeps in a corpus. So such images help, but they also mislead in a way that's worth naming. They make vector space look like the physical world in which words are above, beneath, beside, below, which is a short step from approaching these types of things as interpretable word clouds, which these aren't. So the reason goes deeper than the picture, because closeness in embedding space is not in itself closeness in meaning. Two words can sit together because they behave alike grammatically, phraseologically, dialectically, materially, not because they mean anything similar. So words can also be pulled into relation by other words. There's a classic example of an embedding in which hammer is close to forest because Woody Allen, wood and some type of tool, an Allen key, looms so large in the corpus on 20th century film writing that his name drags them together. So this way of relating words in hundreds of dimensions by any regularity is nothing like the way we make meaning. And that difference between the model's way of relating words and ours is a key challenge of probabilistic language modelling. So we're just using a toy for this challenge. It's made with word2vec, which is one of the earliest and simplest forms of probabilistic language modelling. It gives each word in the corpus a single vector, collapsing every use into that one position. So that simplicity is important in making the toy work. It's basic enough to be manipulated in ways that we can inspect and engage with. With it, we can begin to ask questions that more recent complex forms of probabilistic language modelling make difficult to even approach. So those questions, as I've said before, is how do our bibliographical objects and infrastructures change as they dissolve into training data? How are they reformed through probabilistic operations? How could and should interpretation work in this context? So here's the kind of thing we build. It looks nothing like the apparatuses we use in periodical studies. So I'm going to just briefly describe its three parts. So along the top are cultural groupings. Because this is a project about Irishness in Australian literary history, several relate to that group, but then you've also got other groups like Englishmen, foreigner, Chinamen, because socio-cultural groupings are made relationally. Down the left are sets of synonyms drawn from ConceptNet, which is a semantic knowledge graph developed for use with word embeddings. And they're organised into categories and subcategories. So this one here is the subcategory wildness in the category emotions and traits. So other categories are speech, class, occupation, politics, religion. You know, we played with this toy endlessly. Don't worry, I'll only show you 3 examples. So both sets of terms are attempts to approach the model's relations among words through human legible frameworks. The closeness of a socio-cultural group to a single word, like rash, could be a complete artefact. But if it persists across a set of related words, then it's worth investigating. The numbers are a particular way of turning position in vector space into a measurement of closeness, so they're cosine similarity scores, and that's just a geometric measure of the direction that the vectors are pointing in. So 1 is exactly the same direction, and 0 means no linear relation was found. For ease of reference, the highest cosine similarity scores are in red and the lowest are in yellow. So my first example is going to stick with wildness, and you might notice that Celt and Irishmen as well a bit have consistently high scores on this particular subcategory. So most of us would recognise, and I don't want to offend this room, the uncivilised or barely civilised Celt as a trope of 19th century fiction. And while this shows the apparatus is doing what we built it to do, it's fair to ask whether this takes us anywhere at all. Is this just background knowledge, or worse, is it just confirming a stereotype? I don't want to dismiss that, but I'm also interested in what happens when these measures, which are inert and flat, averaged across every use, are brought into contact with a single story. What can it tell us about tropes and stereotypes and about the wild Celt in particular? So that question brings us back to an Irish cousin as an experimental object now. I'm sure many in this room could give their own lecture on this text. I feel very nervous talking about this particular one, but I was so far into writing the talk when I realised what it was that, here we are. Anyway, I'm not going to pretend expertise I don't have. I just want to consider how the wild Celt trope is mobilised in connection with this particular instalment. So the trope enters early, in the words of Theo's Scottish Aunt Jane, who denounces that ne'er-do-well Irishman, a creature that 'tis well known had to leave his home for heaven knows what wickedness, his money doubtless won at the gaming table. So that framing, though, is immediately undercut by the narrative voice that presents Owen, the man in question, as an Irish gentleman of good family, whose money had been honestly come by and whose emigration is situated within the broader context of famine and dispossession. So while the embedding suggests that Irishness near wildness is an association of the corpus, this story does something more specific than confirming or denying that trope. It resorts it. So Owen is rescued from the charge by being lifted out of its reach, reclassified as gentry, his money clean. The association of Irishness with a lack of civilization remains, but it's attached to other Irish, particularly to the Irish retainer, the person who looks after the estate and writes in these very sort of dialectically characteristic, letters. Notice also who carries the accusation. It's Aunt Jane, a Scotswoman of the most inflexible type, so another marginal position within Britishness. The instalment stages a negotiation among the peripheries of empire in a newspaper published on the peripheries of empire over who counts as respectable and who stays wild. Remaining with the wildness subcategory, you might also have noticed that Chinaman is the furthest in vector space from these terms. So if we had only this matrix, we might be tempted to assume a spectrum from wild to tame, Irishness at one end and Chineseness at the other. But that's not what these measures show. So across all the categories, all the subcategories for emotions and traits, Chinaman is furthest away from genial and good-natured, from perverse and neurotic, from gallant and touchy alike. So the apparatus isn't placing Chinaman at the opposite end of the spectrum to Irishness or Irishman, it's placing Chineseness outside of emotions and traits. So this gives a sharper form to what might otherwise be filed as another period trope or stereotype of the impassive Chinaman. So read through the embedding, impassivity isn't a trait, a character of being cool or inscrutable. It's a distancing of Chineseness from the whole arrangement of interiority by which fiction grants characters an inner life. So it's an exclusion from the field of feeling. Engaging this through our second experimental object, the Chinaman, that exclusion is enacted as a way of looking. So the story distances its subject from any inner life by piling on the external, so cue hairstyle, whiskers, teeth, gait, gesture, clothing, and it pushes this logic to an extreme ethnographic register. So it opens onto Queensland as a place where the Chinaman can be so well studied in all his metamorphoses, and it invites the reader to see him landing as a raw new chum whose body is rendered as this spectacle of difference. So, I'll let you read it. It's very grotesque. It's a grotesque description. So where the Irish cousin resorts a trope, this story enforces it, enacting the exclusion from interiority, the embedding marked as an extreme ethnographic Orientalism. For the final example, we'll turn from emotions and traits to another category, which is occupations. And I've chosen a couple of subcategories here, but they're basically all rural occupations, shearer, stockman, drover, and they're coded in Australian 19th century fiction or colonial fiction as white settler, nationalist male occupations. But you can see here that Chinaman and Aborigine are among the closest in vector space to these positions. So this is a different kind of association to the previous two. Wildness and its absence were relations we could name as tropes and recognise as relations of meaning. This one does not portend a previously unrecognised population of Chinese and Aboriginal shearers in the fiction, unfortunately, or fortunately, because I can just imagine what they would do with that. What it tracks is co-occurrence. So these characters turn up in the bush settings where those occupations are located. If we understood the embedding or the matrix we've made with it as summarising the corpus, then this would be noise, it would be an artefact. And it would be something we'd discard. But the association also registers something important about the racialised organisation of narrative space. The Chinaman suggests some of what that spatial association is registering. The rural proximity is the goldfield in this story. I just heard some great papers on the goldfield. And across it, the story repeatedly triangulates white settlers, Chinese miners, and Aboriginal people. So there's a single long paragraph in here, and I've transcribed only the very beginning of it. And characters are described as, we've got the Chinese being rejected by the Aboriginal people as neither blackfellow or whitefellow. Chinese men are measured against Europeans and found wanting courage. White violence against Chinese travellers is passed off as a joke, and violence between Aboriginal and Chinese people is narrated for comedy. Through the language of savagery and cunning, respectively. So this story doesn't merely place these figures together in a setting, it uses that setting to reproduce a racial hierarchy. Unmarked white settlers as the norm and as innocent, while racist practice is displaced onto marginalised figures who are shown defining, maligning, attacking, and displacing one another. Okay, so to conclude, I want to take up this idea of a toy and an experiment in three ways to broaden out the questions asked in this presentation about interpretation in bibliographical and probabilistic conditions to the situations in which we're doing periodical studies today, and reading and writing more broadly. Okay, so first, why did I choose a toy? Because next to the infrastructure of part one, centuries in the making, this is what this is. Like, it's a plaything. It's small, provisional, it's specific to this archive and this inquiry. I'm not saying that the bibliographical edifice is going to come crashing down tomorrow, but we can all see the cracks. And we can see them in Trove's API closing down, in difficulties assessing writing, peer review, and undergraduate assessments alike. We can see it in the difficulty of knowing what writing to trust or not. So this toy asks what it might mean to make human-shaped structures of meaning for these technologies. And even then, it could only do that by leaning really heavily on the old infrastructure. Making meaning by moving between this new toy object and the old infrastructure, the matrix and two bibliographical objects. So these changes are too big to take whole, whereas a toy was just a way of trying to get a handle on some of the types of questions we might be starting to approach. Okay, if it's a toy, it isn't a game. The three readings trace different but resonant racial hierarchies. The wild Irishman resorted by class and confession, Chineseness placed outside of interiority and emotion, colonial space racialised so that settlers come out innocent of their own violence. In Discriminating Data, Wendy Chun argues that today's machine learning systems amplify and automate rather than acknowledge and repair the mistakes of a discriminatory past. So knowing this archive as I do, I'm not surprised to find this type of discrimination, but folding every use into a single vector averaged, whatever averaging could possibly mean across those contexts, did seem to produce a toy that amplified harms. But how far does prediction and probabilistic operations extend that? Does it encourage those patterns? I mean, we can see experiments where we're reported on it doing that, like difficulty with facial recognition, recognizing African skin colours. But, you know, we actually don't know the full extent of this issue, and we don't know what to do to counter it. we're asking those questions. Lots of people are asking those questions, right, in computer science as well. And this experiment was really just a toy to see what might be happening for what is actually an experiment running for real on a global scale, with real people's lives, and rather than characters in stories, right? So this is what's happening. And third, if this is a toy, I'm not here to say that Victorian periodical studies are the adults in the room. I reckon we all have to grow up here, probably in new and interdisciplinary ways. But the field does have really relevant experience. So the inheritance I trace through Wolff as a field that has long understood its objects and its infrastructures as entangled, that won't answer all questions, but I think it's an important place to start to ask them. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was incredible. I'm going to get you to catch your breath and then open up the floor to questions and comments. We have a generous amount of time. Would anybody like to start? Jim, please. And would you also give your full name? I can be the camera else. Okay. Thank you, Kathy. We'll swap.
That was a terrific, and well, I'm really loud. I'm Jim Mussell from the University of Leeds. That was a terrific lecture. There's so much to think about, and I'm still trying to process it right now. But one of the things that came to mind is how rich and productive some of the new terms and concepts of this new world in which we're entering appear to us. So when I think about newspapers, I often think about them as a technology for managing and assimilating the new. And so they seem kind of algorithmic to me. They have different inputs and they produce an output, which is a newspaper. I've become interested in a really boring newspaper recently, which went on for decades and decades, and it's almost the same every issue, except it's not. And again, I know there's cultural work going on there, but it produces an output that's the same. And so for me, I'm thinking, I can use all these terms, the algorithmic, the probabilistic, and then use them to analyze these historical phenomena. But I know that's a trap, and they're not the same. So I wondered if you had any advice for us about approaching and using these terms in a kind of anachronistic, retrospective way. What are the opportunities, and what are the hazards?
Yeah, wow, you don't take any prisoners, do you? I mean, great question. I mean, I think that this is really, like I said, we're talking about infrastructure that was centuries in the making, and that we are like the fish that don't know we're in the water, right? And so I think that there is, we went 20 years ago or so, electronic literature was all talking about the way that we're going to recognise the particularities of print through being exposed, and then everyone was talking about hyperlinks. Do you remember that time? Like everyone, it was that was post-structuralism in action, and now it's post-structuralism in action when it's like a word in a language model. So I think there are real traps in taking that too far and drawing too many parallels. I really do think this is actually a quite substantial break in the way that our textual objects and practices have been arranged. But I also think that those can be productive ways of thinking through the questions. I've got this sort of, I wrote an article, and it sounds like I'm like citing myself, which is stupid, but it's just a thing that I try and think about myself with the objects, which is to hold them loosely but not lightly, like to try and think, well, it is true that there were algorithmic dimensions to the newspaper press, and that we don't take that lightly. That's an important part of the cultural practices that have formed how we understand news to work, how we understand media. If we grip them too tightly and imagine that they tell us things about the nature of the socio-material conditions, I think we can get into trouble. So it's just that, like trying to raise the questions without clamping down hard. I've got a colleague who writes about anthropocentrism in a similar way, like that, you know, it's a useful technology for thinking through. Like I was dismissing all the cognitivist. He does great work, you know, so I'm glad he wasn't in the room. But he also says that's, you know, a productive way for thinking about, you know, post-human encounters by thinking, where is this border between the human and the non-human? Yeah, but, you know, we had centuries to get used to this, this edifice that really protected us and gave us a set of trustworthy systems, and we could trust in them, and we could trust them to bring many different things together. I think, yeah, I'm taking it somewhere else now, so I'll stop, but yeah.
Jim has set a very high bar for the questions now. Thank you, Jim. So if anybody else would like to follow him, please would you also, when you have the mic, if you could give your name before you give the question, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Hi. Oh, it is loud. I'm Annalisa Hansen-Trout. I love this. It was incredible. So I have a question about representativeness that's more of an invitation for you to riff on some of the utility here. So I've been thinking a lot about when we treat sources as representative and then make claims based on them, and about the fact that Bayesian statistics on which some of this is based assumes a sample of a larger set, right? So when we make, when I have made claims using logistic regression on a complete sort of population, I'm actually using the tool wrong, because the tool is designed to judge whether a particular subset is more or less representative of the whole. So that's like in the back of my brain. And then I was thinking about what you said about flattening all of these instances across the corpus. So my sort of big question is, like, how big of a corpus is too big? At what point does trying to be representative mean that we're actually missing small utility? And then how big of a corpus is too small? I'm sure you've thought about this, and I would just love to know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that terms like representativeness live in a universe of objectivity and subjectivity that is entirely reliant on the infrastructure that we have not been able to see as holding in place the interpretive structures. And I don't think it holds. And so I think we need to rethink what we mean by knowledge practices outside the sort of fantasy we told ourselves that this was like some mirror of that, but a partial mirror or a bit of a mirror, or a, you know, and I think that is not happening in the way that the problems with these models are being discussed, often in terms of bias that assumes some sort of amplification or mirroring that is direct, when I think we need to think carefully about the way, well, we can't think carefully about it with a lot of these proprietary systems because we're not allowed anywhere near them. But, you know, we've got to recognize that these are structures that are making arrangements in a particular way. So I was thinking about your burst, what were they called? Like, it's not an algorithm. What is the burst method?
It is an algorithm, it's just burst analysis.
Yeah, so burst analysis. So that was a really interesting way of highlighting forms of frequency within your corpus that you were interested in, and you know the materials very well, so you can think about it as something other than a snapshot that's going to tell you the truth about what's actually happening at this time. But, you know, I imagine it was formed for sort of biological analysis maybe, or DNA. I don't know, where does burst analysis come from? Maybe this is a
I mean, like many of our tools, it was
it's
surveillance.
NLP.
It was surveillance. So
surveillance,
it was
yeah.
DARPA to surveil people's emails. That's why we have that algorithm.
Yeah, so it makes the example resonant because these are formed for asking particular questions, and we often adapt them. I mean, this is what we've been doing in digital humanities for a long time, from compulsion sometimes because we lack the resources, but also sometimes from a sort of naivety that we're going to see the truth with data. And I think it's time. I mean, I'm actually just finishing a book. I'm giving it to the publishers in September, and it's really just it's trying to say, like, if we don't have objectivity and subjectivity to lean on as poles that support the disciplines that we imagine as structuring how we know things, what do we resort to? So yeah, I do have an answer. I just don't think I can quite fit it in here.
All right, thank you very much. Who's next? Yes.
So make Prithi work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Bryce Creary from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Correct me if I'm completely off base here, but part of my interpretation of what you're saying is like, we're trying to merge these two fields, which are often a little bit different, these two different modes of analysis of qualitative and quantitative, that we're taking these very quantitative bases and then using judgment to come to better conclusions than previously were possible. And then you end your talk with this kind of challenge. You're saying, in Victorian studies, in the humanities, and also in data science as well, we're both gonna have to be thinking about the shortcomings of using these individually. I was just wondering if you think that there's something necessarily mistaken about purely qualitative analysis, that it's going to have to reckon with data, or do you think that they're just each have their own advantages?
Thanks for your question. I mean, I think that qualitative and quantitative analysis is a false divide. I mean, I think that, from the invention of print, it was understood as being about units that had numerical values as well as forming words that could be read as words. There's a really interesting article about how it was used for cryptographic analyses. They could tell what length. They realized that printing presses, the letters were wearing out at different rates in different languages, and they built a sort of algorithmic cryptographic system on that. So I think that that as someone who spends a lot of time curating data, as was mentioned, I don't ever feel like I enter this quantitative space and that it has some sort of different evidentiary weight than when I'm reading words as I did of these stories. I mean, they are very different things, as our material objects are always different. But I think that there's a lot of unjustified leaning on quantitative analysis as if it is somehow more objective, to use the term again. So I don't think that we're moving. I think you're right. We're moving across them, but we're doing that all the time. I find writing an interesting sort of way of thinking about how data. I've got to remember to say it in the American way, because I once gave a talk about data and someone thought it was like dataism, like how data is actually a form of writing. And so I think that we are also not marrying two fields. I think that there's a view of science as if it's one thing, which it never has been, but also as if scientists are not aware of the material particularities of their objects and their knowledge practices. So this last slide is like the adults in the room, let's grow up, let's do some adult education together. I think that we need to come together as a set of disciplines who still believe that it's worth producing knowledge. And I think that universities are under attack, and we're internally divided because we look across at our science colleagues and we think they have all the things, and but they don't have all the things. Like they look at their Silicon Valley colleagues and they have all the things, you know. So I think we need to, think about different transdisciplinary ways of asking questions that draw on the expertise. And I think that Victorian periodical studies, as other forms of book historical, publishing historical studies have this deep awareness of the way that the material conditions of the circulation of text are constitutive of the meaning of what can be generated from it. And I think that is a very important thing to bring to the table. But it's part of a feast. I mean, I'm wearing this metaphor out. It's part of a much broader and bigger conversation. And it has to be because I think the infrastructures we've been relying on, like I said, are only so reliable because they've been around for a long time and people have been able to form their practices in relation to them.
Okay, thank you so much.
And again, on this side of the room, I think I see David as the first hand.
Giving
I think
Mary
there's
a
someone else at the
workout
back
there.
for later. Yes, I won't forget you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm David Finkelstein from UCL. What a pleasure to listen to this. And actually, I wanted to make a point and then a question. And the point relates to this slide, because you're talking about the idea of the quantitative, qualitative issues. And this slide is a great example of something that requires context. Because you look at the people who are in this picture, you're obviously made aware of it, but think of the individuals that are here. They are Chinese individuals, individuals of color, swagmen on their horse, individuals who are wearing hats. There's a panoply of individuals who may be considered both within society and outside society. And this picture, you could argue flatly, is about adult education, or if it was a satirical cartoon, maybe making another point, but it depends on where you've located it. So I think that's a really important point to make about what you're trying to say, which is precisely how qualitative and quantitative needs to have a contextualization. But I wanted to, and also with that, the question I had was the type of information you use to create the data sets you have. What you gave us, for example, was a list of areas of industry that you were saying people would be associating with Australia, swagmen, bushmen, right? So, and then doing that data set according to that. But that's also an interesting contextualization because it's Australia as a rural space being colonized by individuals who are doing rural things. If you were to flip it around and actually say, what would it be like if you're describing Australia in an urban kind of setting with captions or data sets that look at an urban kind of professional statements, would you have the same result? Because, for example, Chinese in Australia in an urban setting had a different type of setting of activities they were doing. They were, creating teak furniture. They were obviously doing service work like laundry people. They were selling fruits and vegetables and doing. So if you put a list of those types of professions, suddenly they might pop up in a slightly different form and more prominently in the kind of set you're looking at. Would you like to comment on that? That obviously the issue of qualitative and quantitative does require a context as much as anything else, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd start with just the point about the occupations. So the ones that were listed there, they were just two subcategories of 50s, 60s, 70s. So there was like a subcategory that was about waiters and waitresses and busboys, and there was a subcategory about maids and butlers, and there was, so yeah, it was definitely interested in the way that occupations are differentiated by space. I guess it's not like, we started off, I think, with a quite naive way of thinking about these word embeddings, that they were going to show us something about the corpus we were dealing with, and I actually don't think that is the case. I guess the question I was asking, the second question about it not being a game, is I'm not really sure the extent to which that is because it's word to vec, and the extent to which it's probabilistic, the extent to which it's this particular corpus. I don't know. I mean, I don't think, though, that this is the type of thing that we can draw types of arguments like Chinese people, did these types of work, except that we already know that, so we know they did. Do you know what I mean? But we're not using these types of things for that reason. And I think that the way we carry them through, like I think the way that word clouds get used as interpretive text that people read, topic models when they're projected as word clouds, you know, they actually are within the genre of the text. Same with chatbot interfaces, that encourages modes of interpretation that these material conditions are not suited to producing. So I think, yeah, how do we work with that urge while resisting it is something I'm interested in. But I thought it was a really interesting point you made about how, you know, this is a decontextualized picture because it comes from the Trove database where I searched, I don't know what I searched, adult in the room, I think. And then I was like looking at and selected illustration, you know, and it was, yeah, it's terribly decontextualized, right? And we don't even know if it's satirical. And it's interesting to reflect on the way that our digital databases modularized information, and it makes me think of debates in the digital humanities around the way that modularization informed the way we thought about identity categories and what we might do to enrich those sort of categories, and how we're now in a place where we're not dealing with labeled data, we're not dealing with supervised modeling. Like I actually, this is why it's a toy, I don't know the answer to these questions. This is decontextualized, but it's like massively contextualized compared to the type of next token generation that we're getting from these frontier models. So it's contextualized by being in Trove, by being in the 19th century newspaper, by being, we know the provenance, we know the processes they went through. Yeah. Not an answer, but yeah, I agree.
There was a question at the back, I think, before, and then we'll get to Caroline.
Hi, Geraldine Meany from UCD. Thank you for a really thought-provoking paper, and particularly the way that you contextualized word embedding in terms of probability. I want to ask you two things, and they're both about probability. One is the improbability that you turned up Somerville and Ross quite quickly with your exploration. And they are, you know, such an interesting kind of partnership. The use of pseudonyms by a pair of women writers, the way in which they position Irishness, which is reflective of a very long tradition, where if class qualifies Irishness, it means something different. So again, this is context that we bring to the data. And I wondered if you differentiated by gender, would you get different results from the kind of the exercise that you did there? Because Irishmen and Irish women have different connotations in this context. And I also, I suppose, wanted to ask your views on trustworthiness and the idea that we have inherited a trustworthy infrastructure. Because the work of feminist recovery in literary history, for example, and I am old enough to remember when the catalogues were your enemy. You had to get in there and find the women, despite the classification of them as, you know, ancillary or subsidiary. So I think this idea that we had a trustworthy infrastructure that we're losing is very seductive. But I think it's also something that we have to keep our eye on. The prejudices and the biases that we identify in the new mode of probabilistically finding answers are inherited ones. They were already always there, I think.
Yeah. So I'll start with that because, yeah, they are inherited. I cited Chan, you know, and she's talking very much about how, I don't know if you've read her book, it's talking about the way that segregationism and forms of racial profiling use the statistical methods that are now used to sort words through homophily and these forms of classification that get used in machine learning, and how that works with an archive that has these inherited power imbalances. And so it's sort of it's sort of like our worst nightmare, right? Bringing together like the worst of all worlds to sort of spit out the next predicted token. So I'm not wanting to give too rosy a view of the past, but I think we were working in a space where we were having conversations with the people who were making that infrastructure, and we were also making it ourselves. So, we had when you think about the possibility of querying whether there were women in the archives, that was a form of intelligible practice that was based on cataloguing, provenance, these types of things that ended up obscuring a whole lot of writing, obscuring the question of who had access to the means of production. It wasn't a perfect infrastructure, but it was one in which we could ask the types of questions that would get to the answer that, well, what if we looked at this group of writers, and what if we talked about incorporating them into the record? And they were. I actually really worry that we're not in a place where anyone is going to be, it's not that there's no openness to that conversation. It's moving so quickly that there's not even space for the structures like peer review and assessment, and there's no attention given to any sort of data curation. We were talking about OCI before, it's all just dumped out, like huge amounts of the past archive. And that's dumped out on a purely mechanistic basis of this produces non-optimal results for next token prediction based on what humans in this particular sample group think is, and I think that is not, it's not only not trustworthy, it's really a very abusable and harmful system. So I hope I didn't come across like I thought that the 19th century archive was some sort of paragon of wonders and, and I do want to defend libraries because I actually think that they're really full of people who are also interested in knowledge and working in collecting and preserving and being able to explore and having conversations about that and actually recognising that they're not perfect. I've never met a librarian who thinks that they're perfect or wants to sort of conceal where a document came from not perfect, and I don't want to idealise it, but it was a space in which we could ask questions and work through forms of knowledge production and evidence that we've become accustomed to working with as how we might work towards trustworthiness. I think we lose that. In terms of whether if I'd selected, I think you mean do you mean if I'd searched, changed the gender tag in the database, and I guess that's sort of what I meant with it's a make your own adventure. We've always been sort of taking objects in this sort of not happenstance way at all, because it's fully structured by the systems that we are engaging with them, and also by our education and by our notions of gender and race and all these things that fill in the way we think about culture and value and what is a literary object, what's worthwhile to study. Yes, it would no doubt change it entirely. And I guess part of what I was wanting to play with the idea of a toy experiment was this idea that experiments are somehow good, optimal, that they prove something. This isn't proving anything. I'm trying to think about what would make this come closer to the ways that we think about the way meaning works in language? Is that a useful thing to do? What sort of things do we think we want to move towards with new technologies? Yeah, it's more like trying to ask that question rather than saying this experiment, because it wouldn't give us any answers.
All right, thank you. I think next to Caroline. And then this side of the room, I will invite you to ask a question afterwards. So no pressure, but it's, equal opportunities.
Thank you very much, Caroline Sumter. That was fantastic. I suppose I wanted to ask you something about conflation of methods and metaphors, thinking particularly around networks, circuits, the kind of models that we've used. And so the way those models change what you see, you might argue that happened before digitalization. The communication circuit was a visual model, but it put in the frame only what we wanted to put there and the kinds of relations. But the move towards network theory and the network turn and the funding landscape in which digital humanities is, more funded than other areas, means there has been that move towards a kind of investment in networks as science rather than visual metaphor in certain eyes of particular funding bodies. So a kind of relative value is placed externally on that, opposed to other kinds of analysis. So I wondered, could you say a bit more about that relationship between, how methods and metaphors get conflated here? I know you have written in really interesting ways around this and network diagrams, but a little bit more on that would be great. Thank you.
Oh, damn, you just took what I was going to answer. Oh, I've written about this. A bit more. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always, so I used a geometric method for querying word embeddings. I mean, it's a metaphor as well as a method. Why is it that we think about things in terms of networks, or we think about things in terms of clusters? Or, yeah, I mean, I think that it's not a bad thing if we understand these as forms of rhetoric and forms of argumentation that we have to take responsibility for. So when I was writing A World of Fiction, as I think you know, I didn't use network graphs because I found that they were very pushing me towards the feeling that I could see what was going on, and then I've presented I don't know how many papers since then, and I always put a network graph in. And they're actually quite interesting because a lot of these were networks of provincial newspapers, and people can see, if you're in an Australian audience, they can see newspapers that are from small towns, and they can see how they're geographically spread but clustered together and that sort of stuff. So I guess I'm moving away from purity. I don't think there's a pure space that knowledge exists, and I think that in universities, we, maybe, hold our nose sometimes at certain commercial practices or whatever, but, I don't think that we therefore have our hands clean. And I guess I just think we need to try and be as responsible as we can. So I'm really interested in what are the conditions that we can make data sets that others can use and they can trust without believing that they're representative, without thinking that they feel certain about what's there, because those sorts of claims, I think, are always, they're a form of false transparency that I think is working against being able to progress what we know about data and collections. So I'm quite interested in how we can use different genres. So I'm currently writing a little chapter of the book. It's the last chapter I'm writing, and I'm interested in what would happen if we thought about the idea of the glossary, and we thought about the idea of narrative, like telling stories, because that's one of the ways we make community and make relations of trust. And then we thought about the methods section and the ethics application, and we tried to make a genre that was trying to do that work. Like, what would some type of genre be that would do something with data that would not be about, like, this is showing what's there. It would be about, this is made. I've made this. This is how I've made it. These are the conditions of the making. These are the challenges, and try and, like, hold it in a space of, like, openness about what was able to be done. So how do we shift that rhetoric from the ways that we have a bird's eye view with a network model to a type of, like, engagement in story, engagement in, yeah. So, I mean, it's not an answer. I actually don't, I'm increasingly not confident in offering answers, but I think, it's a step towards trying to think what are the other rhetorics that might be useful for method.
Okay, thank you. And there is a question from this side. Prithvi, if you don't mind. Thank you. No, you count. You're this.
There's one there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tim Lansendorf at Goethe University in Frankfurt. I'm probably just going to invite you to say the same thing you said already in other words, but I did want to draw on the metaphor you offered at the very end, which were the toy and the game. And I think the question that I have used to be something simple like, how do you know and when does the toy no longer become a toy? When is it actually something more? How would you know that in the moment, right? Because it seems to me that the stuff you gave us can be made useful, but it becomes this kind of epistemological question, right? Sort of what are we after, and are we okay with just having the answer you gave in this paper, and what will we do with that kind of answer? And the same kind of question for the game, and spoilers as it were, right? I come to think of much of what we do as basically just a game, insofar as it doesn't seem to have much.
Sorry, which was that you think is a game?
For my part, literary studies, right? And I hesitate to say this because I'm sitting right next to Laurel. But we spoke about pattern recognition, and one of the things that my kids do is pattern recognition in random shit that has absolutely nothing to do with anything. And they're not only enjoying it, but they're drawing something useful for them from it. And I increasingly feel like this is a thing we're doing as well, right? Whereas, like, who knows if any of this is there? This just was very useful to say X, Y, or Z, right? And I wonder, can you speak to that stupid question?
Yeah, how do we know when a game is something else? I mean, first I would speak in defense of what you're calling games. I mean, like, what is it we're here for? Like, we want to do things that matter, and different things matter. This idea of the divide between leisure and work, this is not the eternal place that humans have always lived, and, I would speak in favour of allowing a bit more room for thinking about what is pleasurable or delightful, or, I think there's space for that in a type of knowledge system I would like to work in. In terms of games, I keep thinking of, like, models. Like, so I'm very interested in modelling. And some models can be toy models, and, like, you can have, like, a model of the solar system. When does it become something other than a game? Like, what happens is infrastructure builds around these models. And so one of the examples is, like, there's a book called The Vast Machine by Paul Edwards, which is about climate modelling and talking about how these climate models that are they started as these sort of things that would be ways of imagining a different future or imagining how the future might work, sponsored, geopolitical alliances and huge systems of cabling and, I don't know, I will just look like a fool if I pretend I know what is involved in. But that's when it becomes geopolitical, and it becomes something that we know is that no one's playing around with. And, I think that we need to recognise that literary studies is also part of some bigger system in that same way. Like, it's geopolitical. Like, it's bound up in huge systems of publishing that spread across the globe that have been changing radically. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't play and have pleasure and try and think about what matters in that context. But yeah, there is no divide, I think. But the problem is we're supposed to make the money, and yeah. Speaking of digital humanities getting funding, I don't know, that was another question which I must have forgot to answer. But yeah, funding, the book I'm finishing off, it was it was over $1 million of funding, mainly in my salary really. But, hiring postdocs and people, and we had great fun and we looked at our data and I think that is not separate from sort of saying, this is in the national interest and I'm going to extract data and, discover new horizons or whatever garbage I wrote to get this money. How do we play this game in a way that we want to do things that we think are useful to do, but we know what the game is like. Yeah, and I think there's a sort of suggestion that digital humanities is naive to that. It's not naive, but it's also not corrupt. So, yeah.
There's one more question.
All the time. Can be.
Thank you, Kath. There's one more question over here, and then we're going to wrap up.
Hi, my name is Stephen Donovan. Thank you for this fascinating talk. I'm not a tech person, so this is going to be a naive question, but as we watch this historical moment that we're living through as you describe it, there's clearly extraordinary excitement in so many fields, from astronomy to medicine and so on, that long-standing problems and also fields of knowledge are being resolved and answered in unexpected ways. And I wonder if you could bring your kind of expertise, long expertise in this area, to why we're gathered today, which is this relationship to Victorian periodicals and the challenge of scale. And I wonder what long-standing questions or issues or kinds of knowledges you think might become possible for us to answer with these affordances in the next few years or the next decade? What could happen, do you think?
The first question and the last question. I think that prediction is a tricky game at the moment. I really don't know. I feel like I've cured myself of thinking, they can't do that, or things are changing very, very quickly in terms of what these frontier models and even what the open models are doing. So I'm not sure about predictions, and I don't want to give an overly negative view, because I actually think it's pretty, it blows my mind that there can be a process of next token prediction that produces human-sounding language. I think it really changes the way we might inquire into the nature of language, the nature of communication, of being human. I think that who knows what we could find out about Victorian periodicals in that sense. I've been really interested by forms of training with large language models recently, of coding and asking very specific questions but generalizing them across large digitalized corpora. So I'm working at the moment with a bunch of contemporary social media reviews. I would never do that with my absolutely messy as anything OCR. We did actually some OCR correction with a Claude model, and it did it brilliantly, but we worked out it would cost $100,000 to correct it. We did some with an open model, and it went into a tantrum saying, you can do your own work. I'm going to go and have a shower. That was a year ago, and there was no publications around, but now the publications come out and they're working with these terrible models because they're the only ones that the academics can actually see how they're actually making these predictions on OCR and actually work out if they can improve them and that sort of stuff, The others ones are so far out of the financial reach. So I think that there are just so many factors involved. There's also the environmental problems of these models. I think that it's also changing the nature of what scale is. Like we think about scale in relation to bibliographical objects. And those forms of scale don't really work in these high-dimensional vector spaces. So that might be another way that we have to rethink the propositions we've made about how knowledge works. Don't know though, who knows?
Thank you for a wonderful conversation and a sparkling talk. I hope your world has been rocked as I predicted. Please put your hands together for Kathy Bode. Thank you very much.
So really quickly, don't stand up. I've got a captive audience. I need you. There's an echo here. Couple of quick announcements. Those of you who have been to the Dickens universe will get this next reference. I haven't been channeling my inner John Jordan very well, so I'm going to take this moment to channel my inner John Jordan to tell you a little bit about the schedule. So we will go off and get some fresh air. If you signed up for one of the casual dinners, they're all at 7 o'clock. So find your way to your dinner. If you've forgotten what dinner you signed up for, Mary will always help you. So if you are also going to the business dinner, don't forget that is at 7 p.m. and don't ask me where it is, but you can ask Mary. Mary will probably be able to tell you. And then I just want to say a couple of quick words about tomorrow. We'll begin tomorrow at 9 o'clock, as we did today, but the schedule will look a little different. At 12:30, you will come down here, but there will not be lunch there. If you see lunch trays, you are going to pretend they are invisible, and you're going to come right into this room, because we will have our AGM at 12:30. The AGM has lots of scintillating things on the agenda, like bylaws. Okay, but we'll get through that really quickly. And then Mary is going to share with you just this fantastic news. If you read the reports, you know it. But there's a BNA, British newspaper. What is it? Thank you. There we go. A scheme for RSVP that's very exciting, and we want to hear from you. Mary will tell you about it. We want to hear from you about it. So, and then we will also, I will tell you who the Colby finalist is for this year. So come in here at 12:30, and then at 1:15 you will go out for lunch. And then just last piece about tomorrow, we have a closing reception at 5 p.m., which is somewhere? Which is somewhere. Yes, over there. Follow the bases. So that's just telling you, I'm channeling my inner John Jordan and telling you about the schedule and how it's different and for tomorrow. So once again, go on. Thank you so much for a wonderful second day and for all of what you all did to make it such a great day. So thank you.